So turning to some influences, first and foremost, and definitely I think most important to think through, is Peter Thiel. Probably needs little introduction for many of you. Thiel co-founded PayPal with Elon Musk. He was the angel investor in Facebook, and he developed what came to be called the PayPal Mafia, and it became kind of the blueprint for modern Silicon Valley. And if there's one book I could recommend to you, it is The Contrarian, which is a biography of Thiel. It is amazingly revealing and informative. In terms of politics, Thiel has, been libertarian generally. He has taken the position, and he's on record taking the position, that freedom and democracy are not compatible. So he also seems to gesture toward supporting authoritarian rule in some unspecified sense. In terms of Trump and Vance, so Thiel, and my understanding is he saved Trump's campaign in 2016 after the Access Hollywood video. Thiel supported him publicly, threw a bunch of money at him. Steve Bannon took over the campaign. He spoke at the RNC, and they won. And he was vilified in Silicon Valley when he did that, but he created a permission structure that many tech titans were to follow in the 2024 election. He introduced Vance to Trump and was the person who lobbied the hardest, my understanding is, for Vance to be on the ticket. Vance also worked for him as a VC for a while. And so, there's both intellectual influence to consider there, as well as, what are the economic incentives and how much does, Vance do what Thiel wants him to do? I don't know what the answers to those questions are, but they're questions to be thinking about. The next one is Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug. Was his pseudonym. He was an internet blogger in the late aughts and 2010s, became very popular in right-wing sort of Reddity circles online. And he advances a philosophy it's been called neoreaction. So Yarvin believes that American democracy is basically a corrupt oligarchy that is run by elites who serve their own interests rather than the public interest. And he thinks that this is something that spreads not just in government, but it's throughout the media, through universities. And Yarvin calls this wide conspiracy the cathedral of shadow, not so shadowy elites that rule over us. And if you notice in interviews, Vance will refer to what he calls the regime, that we have to resist the regime. That's his translation of Yarvin's phrase, the cathedral, the sort of liberal establishment. And so Yarvin actually was funded by Thiel. Thiel funded one of his companies. He's also a software developer. And he's sort of known as the court philosopher in the Peter Thiel universe. And Vance has said that Yarvin has been influential on him, has given him a lot of ideas. Yarvin identifies as a monarchist, so another sort of professed authoritarian like Thiel, and thinks that basically like enlightened corporations should run things. So it's a very short, kind of overview, but he calls his plan for overthrowing government rage. Retire all government employees. Rage. And as many of you probably know, a proposal quite like that is in Project 2025. So this idea of, as Vance put it, enacting a de-Bathification of the federal government also has ties to Yarvin and his sort of authoritarian views that we need to, debug the bad programming of the federal government as if it's poorly designed software. Another influence, and this coming more from the Catholic and religious perspective, is Patrick Deneen, who I've spoken about here before. So Deneen is one of the most prominent post-liberals. He wrote a couple of books over the last several years attacking the liberal establishment and proposing that liberalism as a philosophical and political project, which we could understand broadly as modernity as such, right? Liberalism, orange modernism, has failed because it has an individualistic view that cuts us off from communities and creates a rootless and placeless and faithless citizen, which is to say, it erodes citizenship itself and it turns everyone just into selfish and striving consumers. So a bit of a gloss there. But by liberalism, he means not just the left, but the left, the center left, and the right. So even somebody like Mitt Romney would be a liberal in Deneen's sense. And so Vance's rejection of the conservative establishment, the Wall Street crowd, the investor class, the donor class, et cetera, is a function of that. And the Catholicism is important too, because there's a conviction by Deneen and many of the post-liberals that the attempt to build a secular society is ending in disaster. And many of the social and economic ills we see around us are a function of this bogus philosophy. And so we need a kind of re-traditionalism. We need elites who believe in traditional values and change our institutions to help develop traditional virtues in people and help rebuild healthy traditional communities. In spiral terms, the post-liberals, I think, see the world this way. They see religious people as under attack from a hostile, pagan, and red world of selfish, egocentric people. That's how they tend to see people who are orange and green, let's say. They see them as coming from below rather than above. So here's Vance with Deneen in DC. Welcome him for a talk. Here's Deneen meeting with Viktor Orban. Orban, president of Hungary, is sort of the poster boy for the post-liberals. And, Vance speaks very positively of Orban, partly for he breaks with the EU, but partly also because he's trying to build what's sometimes called an illiberal democracy that veers into Christian nationalism and that has extremely pro-family policies. So the Hungarian government really powerfully subsidizes family formation, and it's one of the things that really drives Vance's politics. And behind Deneen in that photo, you can't quite see it, is the next influence, which is Rod Dreher, who I've also talked about here before. He's most famous for his articulation of a kind of crunchy conservatism, the spread of what were often sort of hippie values and lifestyles of grow your own food and make your own clothes and homeschool your kids and retreat into intentional communities, but designed around Christian values, what he calls the Benedict option. With withdrawing, pull your kids out of public schools, don't let them be indoctrinated by woke, godless liberals, and so on. Vance also has a personal connection to Dreher. Dreher was at his baptism. Dreher is an Orthodox Christian, but they share a lot of the same, I think, critique of what's wrong with sort of modern mainstream secular liberal society. So Dreher is an interesting player in this story because I think the Benedict option ethos has an unusual combination of blue tradition, but also this kind of green countercultural vibe that's about decentralization and reconnecting with the local. So it's an interesting part of the culture. The next is James Orr, and this represents another plank in the new right that Vance embraces, called national conservatism. Orr is a professor of religion at Cambridge in the UK. And, you'll see him on, the Jordan Peterson podcast, and he's in that kind of circle with these new intellectuals on the right in the Western world. And he and Vance are, have become close personal friends. They both spoke at this conference a number of times, the National Conservative Conference. And, this movement is not necessarily religious, but it is this idea that, Margaret Thatcher was wrong when she said that there is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and families. There is such a thing as nations. It's an important unit of political identity, and we ignore it at our peril. And they tend to see multiculturalism as destroying a sense of national identity, of shared borders, shared history, shared identity. And that gets tricky because sometimes it's entangled with ethnocentric ideas of, people who look like us and, a sort of white nationalist kind of idea. They disavow themselves from that, but it's kind of adjacent and they're difficult to separate. So that's another thing that's driving, I think, Vance's thinking as a more nationalistic conservatism than the old right embraced. Lastly, I'll mention is a tension in Vance himself, I think, and one that's going to play out. We're already starting to see play out with respect to HB1 visas with, the Trump administration, is the tension between the techno-accelerationists, the new right, the tech right, which Vance, has personal connections with, and not just Thiel. Mark Andreessen also was one of the investors in one of the firms that he used to run. So, and that's part of what greased his way into, the highest echelons of power. But part of the thinking about hyper-modernism from the standpoint of Integral is that it dissolves blue. It dissolves blue tradition. It disrupts things, disrupts settled ways of life. It outsources jobs. It eliminates jobs, builds factories in places that displace people, etc. Not to mention what it's doing to, people psychologically. And this is another thing that animates Vance. He's very outspoken about the role that, say, pornography plays in the development of young men and the arrested development of young men. It'll come to in a little bit. So there's a tension between that and another group that Vance has strong ties to, which I called on here before, the prudent populists. The spokesperson for this is Orrin Cass, who runs the American Compass think tank. And I already mentioned this before, so I won't dwell on it, but it's pushing back against the free market consensus and saying we need a more pro-worker economic platform and think about people less as consumers and more as workers, and more of an economic nationalism. So that's going to be a tension that I think we're going to see play out a lot